there was a point where Milwaukee used to be recognized, particularly for Black people, as one of the best places to live. And then now we live in an era where Milwaukee has been voted the worst place for African Americans to live. So it really depends on the demographic that you ask. I'm sure if you ask white and maybe Hispanic, they may have a different answer. But I know many Hispanics who may have the same answer, which is it's pretty rough in terms of being a person of color. But for Black folks, for Black people, it's been really, really heavy being a part of this, of seeing the decline in the city in terms of, production for Black people in Milwaukee. One, I would say race relations. Two, I would say affordable housing. And three, I would say jobs. And I know there's a lot of conversations around police reform and public safety, but many times those fit under race relations, especially in which the engagement of law enforcement has been in communities of color, the history behind that, right, and the continued tension of police-community relations. So if there's a focus in which the trajectory of Milwaukee can change, you definitely have to deal with the impact of racism here, as well as dealing with affordable housing and dealing with jobs. Because when people are comfortable in terms of where they live and they're making family-sustaining wages, that actually alleviates the issue of public safety, right? Which then potentially decreases the engagement with law enforcement. Well, racism is a hard issue for people to address, right? That is, a very difficult conversation anytime you're talking about the impact of racism, right? And a lot of people tend to become hesitant with that type of a conversation because the first thing that people they'll start pointing inward and looking at themselves personally without looking at the impact of systems and structures and institutions, right? For example, we understand that, educational inequities exist for Black and brown students, right, in underfunded public schools, right? That's system issue that has nothing to do with personal. We understand that there are inadequate healthcare services provided for people of color, particularly Black women, right? That's a system issue, right? But anytime we talk about racism, people tend to look inward and think you're attacking them. So then when the conversation comes up, there's this defense mechanism of saying, well, I don't think that racism is as problematic as you believe that it is because it's not affecting me. I'm not racist. Versus saying, but how are we analyzing these systems, these structures, these institutions? We know that housing discrimination still happens, particularly towards Black and brown people, right? We know that discriminatory lending practices still happens, which leads to the lower percentage of Black home ownership in Milwaukee. That's system and structures, though. So until there's a willingness to actually acknowledge what the true issues are, we're going to continue circling the wagons on why there's this dichotomy of lived experiences for one demographic versus another. So if there's a willingness for people to engage into those conversations, then you can have a different outcome in terms of polling and quality of life for all residents in Milwaukee. When people talk about violence, I really want people to understand that the only form of violence is not communal or interpersonal, right? We understand gun violence is something that's important to talk about. Gun violence, domestic violence, trafficking, suicides, all of those are very, very important within the conversation of violence. But we also have to talk about housing discrimination. We also have to talk about education inequity, healthcare inequities. All of those are also forms of violence as well, because many of those come from long practices that caused intentional harm on particular communities, right? So the full gambit of violence has to be discussed anytime we're elevating these types of conversations around equity. So, my challenge to people is to recognize that in order for Milwaukee to truly change, Milwaukee has to be honest with itself. And you can't be okay or accepting of a good experience for some without acknowledging the bad or poor experiences for others.